this is to extreme weather and a changing climate. I'll share some highlights from FCA's recently completed report on climate change adaptation, which you see the cover of here. The key themes that I want to emphasize in my presentation today are, first of all, the importance of taking a proactive rather than a reactive approach, in that it is often much more cost-effective and can avoid a lot of damages and negative consequences to plan for the impacts of a changing climate ahead of time rather than simply react to impacts that occur. The second theme is to take a risk management approach, which is to prioritize those risks that are most likely and also of greatest consequence, and to go through a process where you're making decisions under conditions of uncertainty, but given that we know enough now that there will be impacts that need to be prepared for, to go ahead and make those, take those actions rather than simply wait for perfect information which won't arrive until it's too late. And then third of all, rather than creating an entirely new a new climate change program, to integrate responses to climate change into existing procedures. So the outline of my presentation today pretty much follows the outline of the report, which is to first provide some general background, then to discuss the climate change impacts that are most relevant to public transportation. Third, to talk about some of the risk assessment tools that are relevant to public transportation agencies and how they can be applied. Third, to talk about some of the adaptation strategies specific to public transportation, and then talk about incorporating those into existing agency processes such as asset management systems, the transportation planning process, et cetera. The report has 4 case studies, some of which I'll touch on today, and then I'll conclude with a discussion of FTA's activities in this area. So first, by way of background, why is this issue important to FTA? And the answer to that question is that climate change directly impacts top FTA goals. That is, goals of state of good repair, ensuring that our transit assets are maintained and brought up to a state of good repair, and second, and very important, that of safety, making sure that the traveling public is safe and that workers are safe. Next, FCA is the steward of $10 billion a year in federal investment in public transportation, which will be impacted by changes in climate, such as flooding and heat waves. Then we also have a new mandate from the White House Council on Environmental Quality for all federal agencies to be incorporating climate change considerations into their policies and programs. And then it really boils down to that climate adaptation is responsible risk management. We know that there will be impacts, and it certainly makes sense to plan for reasonably foreseeable events. By way of background, the background to the issue is, of course, that greenhouse gas emissions trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere and are essential to keeping the planet warm enough to sustain life as we know it. However, greenhouse gas levels have increased dramatically since the Industrial Revolution, and in fact, concentrations of the predominant greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, are up 36% since the Industrial Revolution and are on track to be 2 to 3 times higher. Tracking the increase in carbon dioxide emissions is global average temperature. The global average annual temperature is up 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900 and is projected to increase by another 2 to 11.5 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. The severity of the future climate change impacts, such as flooding, heat waves, sea level rise, depends on the level of emissions that humans emit going forward. And so when you look at these types of studies, including this one, you'll typically see impacts discussed under different scenarios. So for instance, a high emission scenario or a low emission scenario. And most of these studies rely on the emission scenarios developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was set up under the auspices of the United Nations. So you'll see here, for instance, in the upper left-hand corner, the different scenarios developed by that body, with a higher emission scenario at the top and the lower emission scenario towards the bottom there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see a plot of actual emissions. And so you'll see that actual emissions are actually above the highest modeled scenario, So when we're talking about the high emission scenario, keep in mind that our current emissions are actually above that level, so one might expect impacts that are actually greater than what those emission scenarios are showing. The graph that I just showed you come from the U.S. Global Change Research Program report, Global Climate Change Impacts in the United States, which I would highly recommend as very good reading. It's written for a broad audience and packs in a lot of good information in a way that's fairly straightforward and easy to understand. And one of the key points from this report is that climate change impacts are already occurring. We're already seeing increases in heat waves, increases in heavy downpours, and these changes are expected to increase. However, the level of future climate changes and the impacts depend on the choices that we make today. Speaking of those choices, both mitigation and adaptation are needed in responding to climate change. Mitigation is needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or sequester carbon in order to reduce the level or stabilize the level of emissions in the atmosphere. And what climate science is telling us is that we need an 80% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 in order to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. Then adaptation is also needed because climate impacts are already occurring and additional impacts are already built into the system given the level of long-lived emissions already in the atmosphere. So adaptation means taking steps to moderate the negative effects of climate change. So raising bridges or using materials that are more resistant to high heat. Now I'll talk about some of the impacts of climate change specifically on public transportation. First of all, an increase in intense precipitation can lead to flooding of tracks, busways, tunnels, parking lots, different facilities, also landslides for steep slopes. An increase in very hot days and heat waves can lead to track buckling, where the rails expand and buckle, which is obviously a very big safety issue. And most rail agencies will issue slow orders on very hot days to guard against this. There's also very strong impacts on customer and worker comfort and safety, especially for customers with existing health conditions or who are elderly. Rising sea levels can flood transit facilities, and an increase in hurricane intensity causes flooding, high winds, debris, damage, and also public transportation is often called upon to provide evacuation services in preparation for hurricanes. Now, an important point I mentioned earlier is that climate impacts are already occurring. So, for instance, you can see on this map here that over the last 50 years, this is between 1958 and 2007, the intensity of very heavy precipitation has gone up, and it has gone up the most in the northeast area of the country, which is home of some of the largest and oldest rail transit systems. So that's where you've seen the biggest increase in heavy downpours. And this is what that looks like. So in August 2007, New York City experienced a rain event where they got up to 3.5 inches of rain in a 2-hour period in some areas, and that overwhelmed the regional drainage systems and the subway system pumps that were designed to handle no more than 1 3/4 inches of rain an hour. And this disrupted 19 major segments and forced the shutdown of much of the subway system, affecting over 2 million customers. The Columbia University scientists that MTA worked with project very similar types of floods to be even more common in the future. But climate change impacts are not just something for the large coastal systems to be thinking about. They're also something for the smaller inland systems to be thinking about. For instance, in Nashville last year, the Cumberland River flooded its banks and swamped the transit agency, maintenance facilities, offices, and bus storage lots. You can see in this photo that a number of vehicles were irreparably damaged from the flooding. As part of the study that we completed, we were able to do some GIS mapping which overlaid the location of transit agencies across the country with climate change impact. So what you'll see, the blue dots are urban bus systems. The blue dots with purple circles are systems that have both bus service and rail service, and the smaller green dots are rural transit agencies. This map shows the wet side of climate change, or the increases in intense precipitation and the sea level rise projections. So you see in the Northeast, Midwest, and Northwest are the areas projected to see the greatest increases in intensity of heavy downpours. And then you see that there are a lot of transit agencies in those areas projected to be impacted by that. Now, another thing to note is that just because the intensity of precipitation is going up doesn't mean that you don't also have droughts. In fact, with increases in average temperatures, you intensify the hydrological cycle such that you have both more intense downpours and more intense droughts. On the sea level rise projections, you see especially in the Gulf Coast region around New Orleans and the southern tip of Florida, we have a number of folks on this webinar from Florida, and Florida is one of the areas most impacted by sea level rise. So you see those areas in blue are those that have an elevation below 1 meter or about 3 feet. So those areas are very vulnerable to sea level rise. Now, simply looking at elevation doesn't tell you the whole story, because in some areas there's erosion, so you would expect a greater impact. In some areas there's subsidence, again a greater impact. In other areas there's uplift, or the land is moving upwards. Some areas have wetlands that protect the area, some don't. The presence of barrier islands, seawalls, etc., all impact the vulnerability of the area to sea level rise. So the red, yellow, and green lines along the coast incorporate data from the U.S. Geological Survey indicating vulnerability to sea level rise. So you'll see in the Mid-Atlantic region is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, the Gulf Coast region and Florida again, but also on the West Coast you see the San Francisco Bay Area is particularly vulnerable. And speaking of the San Francisco Bay Area, this map shows data from a current effort, Adapting to Rising Tide study in the San Francisco Bay Area, with the blue areas showing those areas that would be inundated by 16-inch rise in sea level. And you see that there's a lot of critical infrastructure in those areas, including public transportation infrastructure and the Bay Area rapid transit system, stations and tunnels across the bay. What's worse is that when you combine sea level rise with an intensification of storms, the impact is even greater flooding. So, for instance, this map of downtown Boston shows the combined impact of sea level rise and an increase in the intensity of storms. So the dark blue hashed area, which is mostly that area right along the docks, shows the current 100-year flood zone, whereas the lighter blue areas show the projected 100-year flood zone, and you see a lot of the downtown area being affected. The C and the H are public transportation stations for the Boston T rail system.
Tina, it looks like Boston may go from being a walking city to a swimming city.
Yeah, Boston has vulnerability to these storms and sea level rise, although it's less vulnerable than, for instance, Miami or other cities. For Boston, most of the impacts are when you combine the large storm with the sea level rise. For others, simply the sea level rise is even without the storm is a problem. New York City is another example where a combined sea level rise and increase in intensity of storms really affects the public transportation system. And this is why you saw in response to Hurricane Irene, prior to the hurricane, the transit agency shut down operations and prepared for this storm surge. They erected aqua dams, which are basically like a tube that you can fill up with water to block the entrance of floodwaters into tunnels, because this map basically shows you the impact of a 100-year flood, which is a direct hit from a Category 3 hurricane, which is what was predicted with Hurricane Irene. Luckily, Hurricane Irene weakened and was not a Category 3 hurricane, but even so did a lot of damage. So you'll see that the red areas are the current 100-year flood without sea level rise, and then when you add sea level rise onto that, you get increasing levels of impacts, and then you see the transit lines in there in color. Taking a closer look at what this would mean, the dark blue areas show tunnels that would be completely flooded under this scenario. Now this is the second of our two GIS maps. This shows the heat side of the climate change equation. And what you see here is that most of the country by the end of the century is projected to have an additional 40 to 80 days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So in some places this would be an entire summer of such days. You'll see in Florida, where many of our callers are, there is one of the areas most impacted. And the impacts of this are, like I said earlier, potential rail buckling and slow orders, and then also in areas that were not, where their systems were not designed for high heat, you tend to see even bigger impacts. For instance, in Portland, that system was built for the Pacific Northwest traditionally very mild climate. So they have these metal ticket machines that sit in direct sunlight, which nobody thought would be a problem. But in the past couple of years, with the heat waves that they've been experiencing there, those ticket machines have stopped working because they can't function when the heat gets that high. This is a picture of a particularly severe rail buckle. Now I'll shift gears and talk about some of the risk assessment tools that have been developed by nonprofits or local government organizations that are applicable to public transportation agencies. The Public Transportation Agency for London, Transport for London, has gone, is kind of at the head of the pack in terms of assessing climate change risks on their system. And they've used a fairly standard risk assessment approach that lays out and prioritizes risks based on the likelihood of the impact occurring and the magnitude of the impact, the magnitude of the consequence should that occur. And so you'll see that they have prioritized them. Their number 1 and 2 priorities are dealing with extreme hot weather, which causes key track signals and communications assets to be affected, as well as staff and passengers. And the number 2 impact being rain and flooding tracks, causing signal damage. This issue of climate change adaptation is a new one for the public transportation industry. However, several agencies have already begun looking at this problem and starting to figure out what they need to do to respond to it. For instance, New York MTA issued the first report that I've been able to find on climate change hazards at a U.S. transit agency. This was part of their Blue Ribbon Commission on Sustainability. They've also partnered with Columbia University and with state and local adaptation efforts. They've done some short-term fixes, such as raising ventilation grates, and I'll have some photos of that later on. Los Angeles MTA, just over this past year, conducted a climate change risk assessment of their assets, and New Jersey Transit is currently in the process of conducting a climate change risk assessment. Waves Transit in Mobile, Alabama is participating in the US DOT Gulf Coast Study Phase 2, which is going on right now. TriMet in Portland and King County Metro in Seattle have been stakeholders in some of the regional climate change adaptation efforts. The regions where they reside are in the forefront of this issue. There are also a couple of agencies that are participating in Federal Highway Administration climate change adaptation pilots. Internationally, Transport for London, I already mentioned, they've also incorporated climate change impacts into the design of a major new project, the Crossrail project, which is a new rail line across London, which will traverse floodplains, and they've incorporated floodproofing to the levels that are expected under climate change scenarios for that region. In Istanbul, they've built a new rail link in that city, anticipating 3 feet of sea level rise and a 1 in 10,000 year flood. in Taipei in Southeast Asia, after a typhoon dumped 50 inches of rain over 2 days, they set new standards for their entrances to be 2 to 4 feet above ground and 6 inches above the 100-year flood level. They've also put in tunnel floodgates. Now, that 50 inches of rain is something that's way above even the most pessimistic climate projections for the U.S., so that can be seen as kind of a high end of the types of engineering solutions that one might think about. So speaking more specifically about adaptation strategies, since this is a new area, there aren't that many agencies that have implemented adaptation strategies. We do have some examples. For instance, as I mentioned, New York City has raised the ventilation grade so that when the streets flood, the water doesn't flow directly into the system. They've also, as you can see in this photo, tried to incorporate some street furniture to provide an amenity in response to taking away that walking space on the sidewalk. And then on the right here, you see a photo of a green roof. And this is an example of an adaptation strategy that has multiple benefits because in terms of adaptation, it captures the rainwater to prevent localized flooding, but it also sequesters greenhouse gas emissions from having that vegetation there and lowers the heating and air conditioning costs for the building by providing additional insulation. The new Kansas City Bus Rapid Transit System also has features that are adaptive. Now, these features were not put in place specifically for climate change adaptation purposes. They were put in place for their other benefits of aesthetics, of providing natural vegetation, local vegetation. But they also have the effect of capturing stormwater and reducing flooding. So you see they have rain gardens here, and then on the lower part of the slide here is a picture of a pervious pavement parking lot, which allows the rainwater to filter into the ground. In Tucson, this is an area that has had a lot of experience with dealing with high heat. The shade structure that they've developed for their new streetcar line has a double-tiered design that makes it much more comfortable for the passengers who are waiting for the public transportation service. And an example from London, we all know about the iconic London red double-decker buses. And, when I was speaking with a colleague from Transport for London, she said, it's a fairly simple thing to paint the roofs of these buses white, but, when we first started talking about this, people were shocked. These are our red buses, how can you paint the roofs white? But it's a very simple approach to reflect some of that heat back up. So that's one very simple strategy. The Los Angeles Metro system, like I mentioned, has done a risk assessment and started looking at different adaptation options that they could pursue. One of those being combining this weather and climate information better with their infrastructure monitoring, with their maintenance plans, exploring the use of more heat-resistant track materials, looking at flood defenses at particularly sensitive locations, and also looking at options during construction, changing siting, changing alignment alternatives, et cetera. Labor schedules in terms of heat waves. And that sort of flows nicely into the next part here in that, what they're looking at is incorporating these changes in the environmental factors into their maintenance processes, into their asset management systems. And that's what the adaptation literature recommends in order to streamline this and make sure that it has a positive effect throughout the transit agency. So there are a number of areas, and the report goes into each of these in detail, but we don't have the time to go into that too much today. But for instance, one particularly important area for incorporating climate change adaptation considerations is into transit agency asset management systems. And this offers a very useful framework for incorporating these considerations into capital plans and budgets. Also, the transportation planning process in terms of siting decisions, investment decisions is very important for incorporating climate considerations. Environmental management systems provide a good structure. The floodplain assessment process, clearly emergency preparedness, response and recovery efforts. As more extreme weather events are projected, that's a very important area to incorporate changes in climate. In terms of incorporating into asset management systems, this is an example of some of the information in the report. You can look at each element of an asset management system and see where climate change adaptation would fit. Same thing with the transportation planning process. Throughout the process, from establishing a vision to system monitoring, there are places where it makes sense to look at these climate impacts. So as I'm finishing up here, I want to return to those three key themes that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which are taking a proactive rather than reactive approach, managing these risks using a risk assessment framework, and integrating adaptation strategies into existing structures and procedures. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the other efforts that FCA is working on. There is this report that I spoke about, and this can be downloaded from our website. The web address is down there at the bottom of the slide, fta.dot.gov/sustainability, and then you'll want to click on climate change. You can download the report. It has a 3-page executive summary if you want the quick and dirty, and then it has much more detail in the meat of the report. The second element of our work here is that we put out a solicitation for pilots of transit agency adaptation assessments. Applications were due August 25th, and we got 24 applications in. We anticipate funding 4 pilots with total funding available of $525,000. And one of these pilots is to focus specifically on asset management systems. So we hope to announce those pilots in October or November of this year and get those underway and started, so that we can have some better information out there for the transit industry and have some assessments at a handful of agencies. We're also working on outreach. We have workshops and webinars planned. We conducted our first workshop on August 3rd in Los Angeles and had great turnout of about 80 participants. We had a great panel of speakers, and then did an interactive risk assessment exercise where people from different transit agencies, MPOs, consulting companies, et cetera, broke up into different groups, tackled a different scenario. So we had a mock transit agency from various geographic regions of the country, and so they went through and brainstormed what were the likely climate impacts, what were some potential adaptation strategies, how would they prioritize the risks to address. So that got a lot of energy in the room, a lot of thinking flowing there. The second workshop we are holding October 5th in New Orleans in conjunction with the APTA annual meeting, and that's going to focus on the state of good repair angle with regards to climate change adaptation. The third workshop we're planning for Washington, D.C. in January around the time of TRB. We had our first webinar on August 8th, and there's a recording of that webinar on our website. We also had presentations from Los Angeles and New York and from the Federal Highway Administration. So if you're interested in that, you can view the recording and the slides. And then we're planning on a couple of more webinars in addition to that. Our administrator issued an FTA policy statement in May, which explains the impact of climate change on some of our key goals and commits FTA to taking action. We also issued a Dear Colleague letter to try to get the word out to the public transportation industry about the importance of this issue. So that's a little bit of what we're working on here. We hope it provides a helpful start for the transit industry, and we also look forward to doing more in the future. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, Tina, thank you very, very much for that really excellent presentation on an extremely important topic. And when you think about it, it's almost the sort of topic that none other could be more important. And this helps to bring us up to speed and helps to allow us to start preparing for what we need to do to help be ready for these sort of changes and help mitigate them if at all possible. Jennifer, would you go ahead and give a little instruction again for people in terms of submitting their questions?
Sure, yes. In the top menu bar, click on Q&A and then type your question in the white box and click the Ask button. You will see the slide on your screen that shows you those instructions in detail with a screenshot. And then Joel will read your question, and Tina will be able to address it so that you can hear the answer.
Okay, and while people are preparing their questions. Tina, I had a couple, and one has to do with the fact that it seems like there is a lot of good information coming out, but there's also a lot of denial, and folks that seem to, make a name for themselves by denying science. And I'm just wondering how we cross that divide that we seem to have now, and if you've noticed if perhaps local and state figures, elected officials, are perhaps more willing to say, yes, I see this is happening, and they may be more willing than our federal representatives right now in Congress. Do you have anything you can mention about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Unfortunately, it's become something of a politicized issue, which is unfortunate because we have very good information from the National Academies of Sciences, from NOAA, from NASA, from scientists around the world that is very clear, and the basic science of it is also very straightforward. The issue of local level versus national level is an important one because at the local level, people are already seeing impacts. So you have, for instance, in Hampton Roads, Virginia, they're already having a lot of flooding from sea level rise there in that area. And I read a news article there where the local residents, if there's going to be during high tide, they park their cars on the other side of the street because they know that it's going to be flooded on one side of the street. So where you have those very specific local impacts, it makes it a little easier to take action. In terms of communicating climate change, there are some resources out there which recommend strategies for connecting with the public, for connecting with people who come from various ideological spectrums, and I would refer people to those. There's one called 7 Americas, which kind of breaks down the population into different belief sets, and then there's also the general psychology of dealing with risk. And human brains are typically set up to deal with very immediate risks and less with ones that evolve over time. So what's important is to kind of phrase it as what's already happening, and that can get people's attention a little bit more. In that for instance, the weather records already show impacts occurring, already show a documented increase in heavy downpours, a documented increase in heat waves, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. And one of your slides indicated that by 2050 we need to reduce our level of whether it's carbon dioxide emissions or other types of emissions by 80%. And I wanted to just clarify, does that mean we need to be 80% less than what we emit today in 2011?
The baseline in the IPCC report, I believe, is 2005, but that's roughly about the same.
Right, right. And how realistic is that?
The IPCC report does a very good job of laying out various mitigation options, and there are a lot of reports out there. For instance, the McKinsey study is one that's widely cited, basically showing that this is feasible. It's not easy because it requires a very rapid and dramatic shift in the way that we harness and use energy. It requires being a lot more efficient, and a lot of those efficiency measures like insulating buildings, using more efficient appliances, save you money, but they're things that we're not currently doing. And then in terms of transitioning to lower carbon energy sources, we have alternatives, but those need to be scaled up at a pretty dramatic level. So it's things that are possible, and with market signals such as a cap and trade system that would put a price on carbon and spur innovation, these are things that when you analyze them, they are entirely within the realm of possibility, but also very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Tina, do you know which alternative fuels are really the best right now for public transit agencies to help reduce the CO2 emissions?
A lot of agencies are purchasing hybrid electric buses, which greatly improves the fuel efficiency and thus reduces the emissions. Some agencies have also used biodiesel.
And I know we're trying to get to that electric and fuel cell model as quickly as we can. But I was just wondering, for those who can't afford at the moment the $1 million fuel cell buses, which ones would be better, clean diesel or CNG or another type of fuel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would refer folks to, if you go to fta.dot.gov/research, there are some reports by West Virginia University that did a comparison of emissions between different bus technologies and fuel types. And it basically shows the hybrid electric being one of the better options compared to biodiesel, or CNG reduces a lot of other local air pollutants, but not as much on the greenhouse gas emissions side. And I don't think they looked at fully electric buses, because that, of course, depends very much on the source of electricity, whether it's coal-fired or solar or nuclear, hydroelectric, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer, it might be just my computer. I don't see questions that have been typed in just yet. Do you have any?
We do have some from our audience, so I'll be happy to read those for Tina. The first one is, perhaps of most immediate concern is the potential increased role of public transit during storm events where evacuation of vulnerable populations is needed. Have any of those cities that have already begun climate adaptation assessment begun to consider the needs of these populations?
Mm-hmm. We had a really interesting report that our Civil Rights Office looked at, produced, and this was in the wake of Katrina, where we saw obviously very vulnerable populations being left behind in an evacuation situation, and found that unfortunately a majority of public transportation agencies surveyed and MPOs surveyed had not focused specifically on the most vulnerable populations. They had done some general outreach to the public, but had not focused specifically on households without cars, on the elderly, on people with health issues, on low-income populations, et cetera. So this is an area where the industry has a lot more work to do.
Great, thank you, Tina. Another question. Have the FCA climate change policies migrated over to Tiger 3 in its EPA goals? Is the carbon footprint method preferred?
I'm sorry, I want to make sure I understand the question. Can you say that one more time?
Sure. It looks like it says, have the FCA climate change policies migrated over to Tiger, and then it looks like the Roman numeral 3 in its EPA goals.
I'm going to assume that the person is asking about the discretionary Tiger grants that are made by the Secretary's office that are multimodal, rather than the FTA TIGR grants, which are the greenhouse gas reduction grants. So the multimodal secretarial grants, the goals for those include environmental goals, livability goals, et cetera. So to that extent, the policies are consistent.
Thank you. How complicated or expensive is the preparation of the GIS analyses, which seems to be the starting point for risk assessment?
It really depends on the existing capabilities. If you have the GIS software, then it's a matter of inputting the data. So it kind of depends on what your existing capabilities are. The data is publicly available. The data, for instance, for these maps that I did came from NOAA and USGS. So it's not necessarily expensive. You just have to have the software and know how to use it.
Okay, thank you. One other question. What is FTA thinking in terms of providing funding for these efforts, either for planning efforts or for actual mitigation activities? You mentioned the pilot program, but could this grow into a standing program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, with the pilot, this is the first time we've done this. We've gotten a really impressive group of applications. I think it's going to depend on how these first ones go, whether the front office decides that this is something worthy of continuing. In terms of, but that's a very small pot of funding. In terms of the much larger pots of funding, such as our big formula programs, those our big formula programs have very broad eligibility. So there's already existing eligibility for transit agencies to take action that mitigate greenhouse gas emissions or adapt to climate impacts. For instance, capital expenses are eligible, so using a different, more heat-resistant material is already eligible under our existing programs, and providing more public transportation service, which provides a low-emissions alternative to driving, is a good greenhouse gas mitigation strategy, and that's already eligible under our existing program. And then on the planning side, our planning grants also can fund these type of adaptation assessments or mitigation planning as well, since those have also very broad eligibility. And we laid that out in the policy statement that's up on our website.
Thank you. Another question from our audience. Institutionally, public transit agencies are often apart from other transportation planning and capital facilities programming governmental agencies. Have any municipalities that you studied begun to consider ways to integrate transit planning with highway planning and investment?
This is a very good question and gets to the heart of a very important governance issue, which is that the authority is divided among different agencies and entities. So whereas the Public Transportation Agency has the authority over its own, assets that it controls, for instance, bus agencies run on roads that are maintained by the Highway Department, and the Metropolitan Planning Organization in the area to convene and coordinate the transportation planning process. So there are various entities that are involved in the decision making. So this is a struggle really for all of the challenges that transportation system in general faces, from congestion, environmental issues, climate change adaptation, all of it, face this same struggle of governance. So in terms of what FCA is trying to do to be constructive in helping integrate transit providers with the other decision makers, we have a program called Transit at the Table, which is helping transit agencies be more prominent in the transportation planning process. And if you put that in Google, you'll pull up some of our reports on that. In terms of examples of agencies that have done a particularly good job with that, the example from New York MTA, they've done a lot of work working with their state and local governments. So that's one particular example I could point to.
Okay, Tina, I think we are at the end of the questions, but I wanted to thank you again for just an excellent presentation, and maybe give you one other opportunity to mention anything that perhaps came to your mind that you'd like to share with us as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, kind of the bottom line is that it boils down to responsible risk management. So that's the thought that I'd like to leave folks with, and really appreciate the invitation to speak on this important topic, and appreciate the interest from the audience.
And once again, we thank you for the presentation, and look forward to working on the subject with a lot of different transit agencies. I know our University Transportation Center hopes to be selected as a transit-focused Tier 1 UTC, and we have every intention of using some of the dollars that we hope to get to study this subject. So thanks again, Tina.
Thank you.
Okay. And right now, the timing of this is just perfect. Tina's presentation wrapped up with 5 minutes to go, and we have a survey that we ask everyone who has attended to take just a few minutes to complete. Helps us out a great deal, as we are always in a state of constant improvement and looking for feedback. So if you would go ahead and fill that survey in before you close out of the screen. And Jennifer, I don't know if we've got information on the next netcast.
We do, Joel. It is going to be held 2 weeks from today, October 6th, and our topic is Development of Pinellas County Roadway Jurisdiction. So it's the same time, same link, same telephone number. We hope that all of you will be able to join us for that one as well. And just another note on the evaluation, we have applied for AICP credit for this webcast. So if any of you will be seeking that credit, please, definitely be sure to complete the evaluation, and you'll receive more information via email when that is approved.
Right. Thank you, Jennifer. And to everyone out there who's joining us, we would like to let you know that we do provide the opportunity for guest lecturers such as Tina today to share the information that they developed through their research through this program. Even though we do have 100+ projects going on at any time, we'd like to make the opportunity available for those who have developed information that's important to all the stakeholders that we all serve in the transportation community. So once again, we thank you for joining us. We're glad that we could keep it within the lunch hour time frame, and we look forward to seeing you at another netcast in the near future. Thank you.